All right, I'm doing Ben Shapiro. Someone send me the clip of Ben Shapiro, please.
Okay, so there's a video that is going around on Facebook and on YouTube. It's from ACT TV called Systemic Racism Explained. Makes some interesting arguments, and I thought it's worthwhile going through them a little bit. So we're going to play the video, we'll stop it, we'll discuss. This video is sponsored by the Benham Brothers' brand new course, Expert Ownership. You can learn to own a business without it owning you.
This video where I debunk systemic racism is brought to you by My Pillow. My Pillow. The only pillow that lets you sleep comfortably at night after acting like centuries of segregation and slavery did not exist.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal...
I can't believe that this video starts off with racism already. In America, you don't need to live with black people if you're living in a black neighborhood. That's the beauty of America, actually.
School district.
Let's not talk about redlining, though.
It's mostly funded by property taxes. His school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes. So
I can't wait for Ben Shapiro's entire take throughout this process to be, just go to a better school, lol. It's actually the Democrats' fault for not letting you go to a better school, lol. Just move. Just move. Are you living in a poor neighborhood? Just move. This is a common problem. He hasn't even made this argument yet, but I already know he's going to make it. This is a very common way that debate lords operate, okay? No matter where they're coming from, no matter what their personal background is or what their personal beliefs are, debate lords always try to make ridiculous fallacies work by over-rationalizing that ridiculous fallacy. We know some other debate lords that literally do this, where they're like, I'm sorry, it's not actually hyperbole. It actually makes sense when you think about it. I'm just trying to understand what your moral foundations are coming from. That's why I asked what would happen if you call the cops on someone being raped.
They're never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities.
So let's talk for a second about school policy. The reality is that if you wanted Jamal to be able to go to Kevin's school, what you'd want is something called school vouchers. You want people to be able to move away from their school districts. One of the chief reasons that Jamal is confined to his local public school is because of Democratic policy that has decided that you must go to school in the district where you live.
First of all, not even true. If we're talking about charter schools and voucher programs, it's not just a exclusively Republican policy. Since the 90s, Democrats have been huge advocates for charter schools as well. School choice is also a substitute for the actual issue. The actual issue itself is, as the ACT video correctly pointed out, underfunding in certain neighborhoods as a consequence of systemic racism and redlining. Underfunding certain neighborhoods is the real problem. You can't just turn around and say, yeah, you know, if you have a problem with your school, just go to another school, forehead. Well, what the happens to the school that's underfunded? Do we just leave that behind? What about the hundreds of other people who are not going to be able to go to the other school? What about all the logistics of going to another school? I love this from the brilliant mind of Ben Shapiro, who also at one point said, oh, is your house gonna, global warming isn't that really big of a problem. Like if you live near the water and the water levels are rising, just move.
So let's say, for the sake of argument, that all of the water levels around the world rise by let's say 5 feet over the next 100 years, say 10 feet by the next 100 years, and it puts all the low-lying areas on the coast underwater, right? Which, let's say all of that happens. You think that people aren't going to just sell their homes and move?
Just sell your house and move. Okay, Ben, thank you. Thank you for that incredible take back then, and thank you for the exact same take here.
This is also why a lot of people have left lower income areas and moved out to higher income areas specifically for better public schools. So if you...
How is this the brilliant mind? How is this the top conservative mind, dude? How, like, it just really exposes how dumb conservatives are when they're like, oh, this guy is speaking facts and speaking very fast. So I am conditioned into thinking that he's actually brilliant.
You want Jamal to have the same educational opportunities as Kevin. Perhaps you should have school vouchers for private schools, or perhaps you should have charter schools, which is what Mayor Bill de Blasio in New York is fighting against, or perhaps you should...
Love that. Again, charter schools, absolutely a part of playing a significant role in cutting the budgets of public education in this country for the past 30 years and have been championed by Democrats. Like, it's not like a exclusively Republican policy proposal. This is 1000% a Democrat-backed proposal as well. It is totally fucked up. I, unlike Ben Shapiro, will point the finger at the Democrats as well. he only is doing it by advocating for a Republican policy and claiming it's just the Republicans that are backing it and that Democrats are responsible for fighting against it.
Should break the teachers' unions, which are costing a fortune, particularly on a disproportionate level in areas where they're not spending enough taxpayer dollars. So I'm all for improving Jamal's schools. I'm also all for Jamal having all the same educational opportunities as Kevin.
Again, hides now that he has made his dumb take, he then tries to patch it up quickly by saying, "Oh, I'm all for funding Jamal's school." No, the you're not. Especially if you are advocating for charter schools and voucher programs, you absolutely are not advocating to fund Jamal's schools. Because of charter schools, publicly funded schools, public education has suffered significant consequences, all backed by people that fund Ben Shapiro. What's a charter school EU dude here? Sorry, gonna briefly mention that as well for those of you who don't know. But a charter school is when you have a private school that does not have to have unions. Some of them do still have unions, but a private school with a private curriculum that gets subsidized by the public and has to have a quota of people that they have to educate, just like a public school would. But they're just not controlled by the local government. It's a fake school. And also, on average, a thing that they won't mention, on average, is that they lead to awful education outcomes. They always, whenever someone tries to advocate for charter schools or voucher programs, they will talk about how successful like one school has been, right? They'll say, look at all these black children that are going to this charter school in New York. They've led to great educational outcomes and opportunities for these black children. When in fact, if you look at the overwhelming majority of charter schools, because they don't have the same kind of regulatory restrictions that public education has to go through, they oftentimes fail. And they fail in disastrous ways where they have to shutter the school and leave hundreds of students in the dark with no other opportunity.
Growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success. The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents.
In order to understand what's going to happen in this video, you have to understand how systemic racism is being defined. Systemic racism is really amorphous term. It could mean many things. It could mean that the institutions of today are racist, in which case everyone would oppose them. Or it could mean that all inequality is explainable by racism, which of course is not sustainable. It's not a good argument. The argument that this video is going to try to make is that all of history has meaning. And that is true. History does have consequences for today. The problem is, as we'll see, the video tries to explain all inequality with reliance on history and no inequality with response to exacerbating levels of income inequality, exacerbating levels of single motherhood, personal decision-making, or any of the other variables that could come into creating the gaps we see today.
Personal decision-making. I'm not even going to comment on that. That's an idiotic conservative brain disease when people are saying like, oh no, it's your personal choices, forehead. Yeah, you know. Here, I'll give you an exaggerated example so you understand it better. Someone who was born in Liberia is not going to have the same kind of outcomes in their life, no matter what their personal choices are, because they were born in goddamn Liberia as opposed to being born in the Hamptons. I don't care what personal decision making sounds like on paper. It is absolutely a product of your material conditions. I wish Ben Shapiro would personally decide not to be a dumbass dipshit for 1 second in his life and actually accurately reflect the reality that history does motivate outcomes currently. Beyond that, you know, the proclivity to be in a single parent household or any number of other factors that he's going to probably, substitute into those little openings in the argument is also is exclusively a product of systemic racism. One factor I will mention to you immediately is this insanely damning statistic that you're about to be very frustrated to hear. 1 out of every 9 black child in this country has an incarcerated parent. That number is 1 out of 23 for every Hispanic child, and that number is 1 out of 52, I believe, for every white child. So if you are truly worried about familial relationships in the nuclear family being destroyed, don't read Thomas Sowell, who tries to say, oh, it's just welfare policies. It's not. It's not welfare that has destroyed the nuclear family. It's actually systemic racism perpetrated by our criminal justice system that leads, that champions the same kind of racist outcomes that people were championing back in the 50s and 60s, which was not that long ago, which Ben Shapiro, I'm sure, will say, oh, that's the past is the past. And talk about how, it's illegal. Racism is illegal, forehead. Great argument from Ben Shapiro that we are about to see. Just wait for Ben Shapiro to say racism is actually illegal. Point me to a racism and I will stop it for you.
After the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce.
So let's talk about redlining. Redlining became illegal in the United States as early as 1968. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act was followed by the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act in 1975.
Racism is illegal. You can't do racism. It's actually illegal. So no one does it. Nailed it. You know why I nailed it? Because you hear one conservative argument, you know all the conservative arguments, okay? No matter how fast and smooth of a talker Ben Shapiro is, he is still advocating for conservative positions. So what he is going to do is cherry pick data points, say that all you need to do is pick yourself up by your bootstraps, and that racism is illegal, so the problem has been solved, or any number of different things like that. And my final take, which is my favorite conservative argumentation technique, is when you use a pre-existing problem as a consequence of systemic racism to say that it's actually the fault of the people itself while avoiding systemic racism's existence.
In 1992, researchers at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston tried to look at the data. They collected information on some 30 variables related to lending decisions. They found that virtually all of the difference between minority and non-minority denial rates was explained by those variables.
Let me interpret this data for you. I don't even need to look directly at what this is. I don't need to go to the primary sources here to tell you exactly what this is. Oh, black people are poor and therefore more likely to default on loans, which is why it's justifiable not to give loans to black people. Okay? This is a total justification for redlining, even though he already turned around and said redlining was a horrific thing. And then literally talked about why that is justifiable to redline. So Ben Shapiro is a coward, of course. He has to say the nice things because he wants to live in Los Angeles, as he does, and he wants his children to go to the nice charter schools or private schools in Los Angeles and be able to operate in a liberal environment. So he has to say racism is bad, redlining is bad. But here's why redlining wasn't actually the way that you thought it was working. It actually worked because those people were just poor. Why were they poor? I wonder why they were poor. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that redlining was literally legal until 1968 and did not end until the 80s.
Black-owned banks were actually lending to white-owned businesses at higher rates than they were lending to black-owned.
This is the classic black people were the ones selling off slaves to other black people. So, how could that be racist? Like, what the are you talking about? It's the same exact argument that is being laid on to black banks now. Oh, it's not racist because black businesses or black banks were doing the same thing. Like, okay, got it, Ben Shapiro. Thank you. Let's not talk about the systemic factors that contributed to the likelihood that every bank was going to most likely give more loans to white people because they had more money on average than black people did. Okay.
That banks were discriminating against black borrowers on the basis of they needed to have higher credit qualifications. What you would see is lower default rates from black clients of banks, from people who are borrowing money from banks in the black community. There are zero studies that show any of this. So the bottom line is this. Redlining was an evil and awful policy. It was made illegal in the 1960s. By the 1980s, the banks were not lending at disproportionate rates. In fact, if you look at among different communities, as Thomas Sowell has pointed out, Asian Americans get loans more easily.
Of course, I was waiting. Thomas Sowell, the white man's best friend for denying systemic injustice. Thomas Sowell. Oh my God.
When it comes to college education, it is also worth noting that, yes, there were many universities that were segregated. There were many universities that did not allow black people to attend. Since the 1970s, the most prominent measure that has been used in order to admit black students to major universities across the country has been affirmative action, which actively discriminates against people who are not black in favor of black applicants, specifically by ensuring that black applicants don't have to have the same test scores or GPAs.
So not only do we have affirmative action that has solved the problem, it's made it worse for white people. Bullshit, okay? Affirmative action is a band-aid on a gaping wound. It is one way to try to right the racial wrongs of the past. Is it the most effective way? Absolutely not. It's not. It's just simply not enough. So I ask every single person who cries about how affirmative action works in this country, one, did you know that the greatest beneficiaries of affirmative action are white women? I don't know if you knew that or not. Look it up. But two, more importantly than that, if you want to not have affirmative action, then actually offer equality of opportunity to everyone in this country. Just offer equality of opportunity, forehead. Isn't that an American principle? I don't understand.
In order to get into those same schools. So not only has policy been corrected, it's been overcorrected in these areas.
Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house.
Racism solved. Now the real racism is against the whites that are not being able to go to state universities or whatever the his dumbass take is.
And got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids.
The basic assumption of this video is that if your grandparents are rich in the United States, this means that you are rich in the United States. And that if your grandparents are poor in the United States, that means that you are poor in the United States. This is factually untrue. The reality is that income changes over time, that there are an enormous number of people in the United States by percentage who are able to rise from poor to middle class and their children from middle.
Let me guess. He's going to say that the likelihood of a millionaire losing all their wealth is super high. Like, this is the classic, like, businesses, 80% of businesses fail convo too.
The biggest problem that we have in the United States right now is not a historic wealth gap. The biggest problem we have is an income gap in the United States. And there's some fascinating statistics surrounding this. There was a Harvard study recently that showed that black males who are growing up in the same household incomes as white males were actually underperforming their white male counterparts, even in high income neighborhoods. You would think that all of this might imply racism, except for one inconvenient fact in the study. Black women who are growing up in the same high income neighborhoods as white women growing up in the same high income neighborhoods, black women were performing at exactly the same or higher rates than white women in those neighborhoods.
So racism destroyed. Yeah, that's great. I love that. I love when they say like, well, actually, in one circumstance, the racial factor was somehow not as significant. So that means in the entirety of racism is destroyed. Oh, great. That's definitely not cherry-picked data from one study in one specific part of that study. I love that, dude. I wonder why he's doing this. What an incredible take. What an absolutely incredible take where he just turned around and was like talking about the opportunities that are offered to high income individuals. Is Ben Shapiro going to start talking about this from a classist analysis now? Is he actually engaging in the beautiful time-honored tradition of dialectical materialism? I think not. The only time that these motherfuckers ever talk about class is to attack the left and to attack progress or progressive points of view, or to deny systemic injustices or systemic discrimination against black folks specifically do not exist. Idiotic. Completely idiotic. Do not be fooled by this shit. Okay, having said that, I can't believe that he himself would talk about the summary of that entire, the summary of that journal that he is talking about. He briefly mentions it and then follows and literally cherry picks a data point about black women in high income neighborhoods, when the overall study shows that black people, even wealthy black people, have less opportunities than other people, other groups and other ethnic backgrounds, even when it's adjusted to socioeconomic conditions. That does not devalue the entire article. That does not devalue the entire journal. You yourself already admitted that. So why are you just cherry picking one single data point here? What an idiotic take.
Which would suggest that there are other factors at play other than simple racism. Furthermore, the basic idea that
there's other factors at play than simple racism. Again, no one says that it's just racism. Okay? Systemic racism. It's in the word systemic. It's a structural force. No one is like personally be like, I'm going to do a racism today. No, you just exist in that racist system and you are either a beneficiary or you're not. It's that simple. And it's deeply ingrained in our society because it's a fundamental part of American development. White supremacy, whether you like to admit it or not, is a fundamental part of American development, just like capitalism is, okay? Whether it's manifest destiny or just straightforward systemic discrimination in the form of Jim Crow in the South and even Jim Crow in the North and like redlining and numerous other ways that black people were denied opportunities. White supremacy is a fundamental part of American society.
Most wealth in the United States is inherited and that millionaires are really only millionaires because their parents were millionaires. That really isn't true either. The vast majority of millionaires and billionaires are people whose parents were not millionaires and billionaires. Chris Hogan, who's a black financial expert, he did a survey of 10,000 people, and what he found was that of those 10,000 people, 74% of millennials believed millionaires inherited their money, 52% of baby boomers did, but only 21% of millionaires received any inheritance at all. Just
This is the dumbest talking point I've ever heard in my entire fucking life. When you are a millionaire, and I will talk about this from my own personal experience, okay? When you are a millionaire, the benefits of growing up in a millionaire family isn't the immediate inheritance that you get from your millionaire parents. Has this guy ever even thought about for a brief moment of how you get inheritance? You think everyone is running around and like expecting their parents to die off so they get money? At which point do you get money? If that's the case, in a country where the average life expectancy is what, 78 years old or 76 years old, then what? We're waiting for our millionaire parents to die off at the age of what? 50, 60? Is that when we're making our millions? No, you make your millions way before that. The reason why I'm going to mention this is through my own personal experience. I've talked about the piker and Uyghur curse in my family. My generations of pikers and Uyghurs have made a tremendous amount of money and have lost it all before their next generation, their next of kin, actually gets to adolescence and adulthood. But it doesn't matter because I already got the tremendous number of opportunities from having an affluent beginning. I was afforded an infinitely different lifestyle than any number of different people who have not benefited from that intergenerational wealth. My father is probably not going to leave me any money by the time he dies. My grandfather, who I'm named after, he died and left virtually no money. He had tremendous wealth and almost had none left at the end of his life. But it doesn't matter because he gave my father an incredible education, incredible opportunities, just like my father before me gave me those very same opportunities, because that sort of privilege does not come in the direct form of financial compensation, you dumb
in reality, the best path toward wealth in this country is income mobility, not inherited wealth.
This opened up a wealth.
Wait, okay. Wait, I don't even disagree with that. Income mobility. Would Ben Shapiro perhaps admit that income mobility is significantly affected by centuries of slavery and also segregation for another century after slavery was abolished? Maybe that's has something to do with the fact that black people don't have that same kind of income mobility in this country that white people do, which is the entire purpose of this fucking video.
As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago.
There you go.
This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances.
As it turns out, there were some complicating factors that don't get cited in this video with regard to this data. The Federal Reserve Board economist tried to explain that this data did not take account of differences that were not income-based. Things like liabilities, employment history, credit record, and other relevant variables.
I don't need to go over this once again. Your credit record and your liabilities are directly a consequence of the material conditions that you were faced with. Once again, centuries of slavery and 1.5 generations of being able to escape from complete destitute poverty is probably going to be reflective in the likelihood that you might have a better credit score. Holy shit.
The truth is that when it comes to redlining, you have to look at the gradations as well. There is always going to be a difference in the availability of loans to people who are living in the highest risk areas as opposed to the people who are in the very...
Why are these areas in the highest risk areas? Again, he's doing the fourth thing that I told you guys, which is like deny the existence of a systemic problem while simultaneously talking about the results of that systemic problem's existence to say that that systemic problem does not exist. It's insane. Like, how does no one point this out?
But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names.
The research is actually a lot more interesting than what is being portrayed in this video. There are several studies here. There was one famous study that was done that suggested that first name differentiation was indeed being used by employers. So if your name was Lakeisha, for example, this is the name that is actually used in the study, Lakeisha versus Greg, that you are less likely to get a callback. There was another study that showed a historically black last name like Washington or Jefferson provided no actual differentiation from historically white names like Greenberg.
Oh, well, one... What? What? Wait.
For example. So if your name was Steve Greenberg versus Steve Jefferson, you're just as likely to get a callback as Steve Jefferson.
What does that have to do with the first name that we're talking about, dude? Wait, what? Here is one study that shows one thing. Well, what about this other study that looks at a completely different thing? Like, what? Oh, okay. So what is your argument here? Just like, hey, black people have white names and you'll be fine. Is that the argument? Like, I'm confused. Because the point that that person is trying to make is that racism still exists even when people are aware of it or not aware of it, when they are acting in a racist or they are driving home racist outcomes. You know, those famous West African last names like Jefferson and Washington, you know. Oh, wait, those were literally slave owner last names that were passed on to black people. Anyway, that's a completely separate point. It's frustrating. My man is trying to say it's class discrimination, not race discrimination. So what is the class signifier there? Because what he's doing there is a quick misdirection. What's the class signifier there? I would love to find out how he decided that black sounding last names are a substitute for class in that circumstance.
In other words, the reason that people are discriminating against Lakeisha as opposed to against Steve Johnson or Steve Washington is because people are actually using the first name as a stand-in for social class. They are figuring that if you were named Lakeisha, it's because you probably came from a more impoverished background. Now, this is not restricted to the black community. This happens in the Jewish community as well. If you get an applicant and the applicant's name is Ben, you might treat that applicant different than if that person's name is Benjamin. You might treat a Menachem different than you treat a Mike. And that is because you are trying to read into the person your perceptions of culture or perceptions of class, not really perceptions of race. That's really, really important when you look.
So, like, stereotyping exists for all communities, therefore it's okay or something? I don't know what. And also, it's okay to be classist? Ben still has yet to explain why he thinks black-sounding last names or black-sounding first names give you an opportunity and insight into why that person might be from a lower socioeconomic standing. He is yet to explain that take. Also, he's doing a class reductionism, I think, but not really.
Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment.
Well, this tends to neglect one key factor. What did you major in? What did you study? It turns out that people who major in education aren't going to do as well as people who major in engineering. According to research from the Center on Education.
Oh my God, dude. Yo, why does this liberal arts major constantly agitate for STEM lords? Well, probably because he knows most of these dipshits who don't understand how to read any of these studies or have no background in social sciences are going to be dumber and take everything that Ben says at face value as though he is completely educated and smart about what the fuck he's talking about.
Force at Georgetown University. This is a quote from PBS. African American college students are more likely to pursue majors that lead to low-paying jobs, setting up many for future debt and underemployment.
Wait, we're talking about unemployment. We're not talking... Wait. We're not even talking about low-paying jobs, which is an entirely different thing that we're going to talk about, but I'm sure he'll get to that in a second, too. We're talking about unemployment in the black community.
In a way, they are using education to climb the social and economic ladder, but they're being steered toward majors that will make them low earners. So, in other words, there are several confounding factors that are not being taken into account in this video. 1, what college did you go to? 2, what did you major in? And 3, what kind of job did you get afterward?
You can see evidence of systemic racism.
Wait, he talked about unemployment. He didn't talk about low wage. He talked about unemployment in the African American community, like how that is a factor He just totally avoided that take and went to black people go into low income jobs. That's not what they were talking about. That's not what the the video was talking about. Am I missing something here?
Racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism.
Now we reach the crux of the matter. The basic idea here is that any inequality can be chalked up to systemic racism. We are now ghost hunting. Notice, they've said nothing in this.
Like, here's another take that I glanced over. The study that he's talking about literally controls for these factors. So they're not going into someone going into an educational field versus another person going into an engineering field. It's just they're going into the same field. It's the same resume or similar resume, similar backgrounds, with the exception that the names are different.
This video about incarceration. Nothing about incarceration. The simple assumption is that if more black people percentage-wise are arrested than white people, that must be due to systemic racism and not due to the number of crimes being committed by individuals who make a decision to commit a crime. When it comes to representation, the truth is there are many, many black Americans in Congress. We've had a black president of the United States. People choosing to run and people choosing to vote, that is an aspect of American freedom. And when it comes to education, there are plenty of...
There's a black president, guys, so, you know, the racism is over and that, black people are just more violent. Why are they more violent, Ben? This is the fun take that someone like Ben Shapiro is too smart to actually say because he's too big of a pussy. And that's when pushed in that corner, they will turn around and say, "Oh, it's the culture. It's the culture." Okay, what about the fact that, black culture is also totally consumed by white people? Is it not impacting them, or is it impacting black people differently? It's always about how black people are just somehow different. That's what it is. Okay, no conversation about systemic discrimination, no conversation about the material conditions, no conversation about over-policing in black communities and the likelihood that black people on the federal level, adjusted for all other factors, still get 20% longer sentencing in comparison to white people, adjusted for all other factors. How do we deal with that, Ben? Is it the culture of the judge who was impacted by his interest in listening to rap music or something? Like, how does the culture argument fit into that narrative, which Ben Shapiro won't mention because, he's a piece of shit and he's trying to give you better ideas of masking your racism, better talking points so you can say like, oh, black people are just, they just don't know what's going on. They're just it's their culture and that's why we need to police them. That's why we need to over police all black people.